All right, we are back. It's the part-time trader, and this week the question that everybody wants answered is, was I wrong? If you've been following me for a little while, you know that I have for some time now, since probably very late 2024, I have been calling for a historic crash in the price of Bitcoin and complete obliteration of the altcoin market. Now, one of those things has already started to play out, but Bitcoin has been holding up pretty strong in recent months. And despite the fact that some of the price action that has unfolded was actually predicted by myself, I suppose lots of people are asking themselves whether my calls for much lower prices are just completely misguided. And increasingly, people are completely convinced that Bitcoin is going much, much higher. The question is that the case, or are there still very early signs that we are putting in a major top here and we'll see prices trading much lower over the next couple of years? I still believe that the price of Bitcoin will trade at about $3,000 in 2027. And if you're interested to find out why, despite all of the price action that we've seen since April, I still believe that we're going to get much, much lower prices on everybody's favorite cryptocurrency, then stay with me. Over the next half an hour, I will talk you through what the charts are telling me and how I will know if I'm wrong. If that sounds interesting, please do stick with me. Hit the subscribe and the like buttons to help me grow the channel. I massively appreciate it. And as per usual, I will kick off this week by reminding you that nothing you hear here or that you might see on my X channel, which is at Part-Time Charts, constitutes financial advice. This is purely for entertainment and information purposes, just me sharing my own ideas, my own musings on the market and how I'm approaching trades and investments that I'm making. So that being said, let's get straight into it. Let's take a look at the Bitcoin chart. So you guys will know, if you've been around for a little while, you will know that I have been predicting for some time that what we are witnessing is the early stage of a major top and the start of a medium-term plunge in the price of Bitcoin. And I still hold that view. And there are some reasons why, which we'll go through over the next half an hour. But principally, I know people will say you keep redrawing the top of this chart. And that's because, look, every high gives you new data that allows you to refine your trend lines, refine your levels. And I still don't believe that this pattern has been invalidated. And I still believe that there are such fundamental weaknesses in the underlying economy and in global macro that we will see Bitcoin trade at prices that most people believe are completely and utterly impossible. And just taking a look at this chart, yes, if we zoom in and take a look at the daily, price has been pretty strong this week. And you will recall that way back in April, as we hit this breakout here, I predicted that we would revisit this top trend line. And it's always bugged me that when price started to top up here and started to hit resistance, that we never quite swiped properly the previous high. We never really took out this level in an emphatic way. And we also never quite got a clean hit of this upper trend line that has been capping price going all the way back to early 2021. But we've seen that this week. Price has pushed up, and you will know that I've been calling for a proper takeout of these highs. The highs that we put back in May and the highs that we put in back in early January this year. And so the question in my mind is this what I've been looking for? We take out the highs, we get back under, we see price starting to trade back under these highs in the coming few weeks, and that is the first sign of weakness that the market is going lower? Or is this some sort of sustained breakout to the upside? Now, the answer to that question is complex and probably doesn't lie just in the Bitcoin chart alone. And I will talk you through why I think the dollar and the state of the altcoin market and stablecoin dominance all points to a correction being on the horizon. But certainly, if you zoom out and you look at this pattern at the moment, I still do not believe that on the higher time frames this is a convincing enough breakout. And if I look at what the monthly looks like and pull up everybody's favorite indicator, the RSI, you know, I will reserve judgment until the monthly close. But at the last monthly close that we got, we made another high. You know, this was the highest monthly close in the history of Bitcoin, but the RSI on the monthly made another low, or a lower high, I should say. And normally what this means is when you see price making new highs, but the RSI failing to make new highs, that indicates some slowdown in momentum, friction pulling the price of Bitcoin back. And I suspect what we're likely to see before the end of the month is some sort of a correction on the lower time frames that will pull the monthly Bitcoin candle back into the territory of the previous close. And once again, what we'll be seeing is a rolling over of the RSI after making a lower high. Now, obviously, that's speculation at the moment, and we will have to wait for the end of the month to see how the July candle closes. But at the moment, the fact that we've had a few green days, in my view, is nothing to get too excited about. And look, historically, when everybody has been on one side of the ship, when everybody believes that price can only go one way from here, and I believe that we are in one of those situations at the moment, typically those are the points of maximum risk. And anybody who was around back in late 2017 will remember what this blow off top felt like. Since then, the market has matured slightly, and we're not getting this kind of crazed euphoria, at least on the price of Bitcoin. We did see some of that on altcoins in 2021. But equally, every time everybody has been convinced that much higher prices are coming, the market has seen a sharp reversal. And likewise, whenever people have been completely convinced that lower prices are coming, the market has reversed to the upside. And this situation really reminds me of both the 2021 highs, particularly the second high that we put in. So you'll remember Bitcoin put in this high here, went through a big 50% correction before bouncing to the upside and making new highs. And at the time, lots of people were claiming that this was some sort of weekly SR flip, and that new highs on Bitcoin was indicating strength, and the market was about to rocket to the upside. And honestly, if you were around back then and you're honest with yourself, there was absolutely universal consensus that that was the case. Nobody was bearish up here. And I'm exaggerating for effect. Of course, there are always one or two smart people, people like Trader XO, for example, that were calling for caution here. But on the whole, everybody on X was completely united in their view that the market was heading for new highs. And if I think back to late 22, early 23, we saw the exact inverse here, where for some time, a period of about 4 months, price had been holding the previous all-time high as support. And then in October 2022, price collapsed to the downside, or in early November, price collapsed to the downside, got under this level, and back here, everybody was super bearish. It felt like a new low. It felt like we had broken back under the previous high, and that for many people, they believed that price was going much lower. I was one of the few that was calling this megaphone pattern out back here, saying that we would revisit the upper boundary of this megaphone pattern in the years to come. Now, I thought that would play out slightly more quickly than it has done. I suspected that we were going to, shoot to the upside pretty rapidly, and that the market would top out in late 23, early 24. As it happens, it took longer for us to get there, but I still believe that the price action we're seeing here is nothing more than a testing of this upper boundary, and that ultimately, in hindsight, all of this will look like one giant consolidation. Price will come down, test this level, and then over the coming years, we will see something like that. Now, that might be slightly ridiculous, and if Bitcoin does go to $6 million, I would suggest that the global economy and fiat currencies are in serious trouble. But notwithstanding, the point is still the same, that I think this is one huge megaphone consolidation before prices begin to trend higher, and I believe potentially into 7 figures over the next decade. Now, nobody believes that revisiting these lows here is possible. I personally think that there is a decent chance that in an economic crisis, in a period of stagflation, we could come back, take out these lows, retest the lower boundary of this trend line, and price will slowly begin to grind to the upside before going to several $100,000 in the early 2030s. And the same way that nobody will even entertain the idea of Bitcoin trading in the $3,000 region over the next couple of years, as we press up against $120,000, in the same way nobody will believe when we're down here that price will ever get back anywhere near the highs that we've seen, and people will be calling Bitcoin a complete scam. There will be lots of news, I suspect, that will have broken alongside the stagflationary crisis that is on the horizon. Lots of people will be calling Bitcoin dead down here because they will say that Tether has been a scam, that exchanges are scammy, that the price action was completely manipulated, there is no organic demand, the thing is completely dead. There will be tons and tons of reasons why people will believe that it's over for Bitcoin and it was all one giant scam. And just at that point, that will be the point of maximum opportunity. And the inverse of all the emotions that people experience down here is what we're experiencing up here, where nobody believes that Bitcoin can trade lower. Everybody thinks it's invincible. Everybody thinks that this is on the brink of shooting off into the $500,000 range. So I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. If we get a clean break above this level, perhaps I will reconsider my position. But for now, I stand firm in my belief that we are going to see much, much lower prices on Bitcoin in the coming years. And one small but important indication that I could be right is this liquidation heat map. Now, remember, as much as people are coming out and mocking me for calling the high on Bitcoin back here, and prices have pushed, 4 or 5% above the previous highs, you have to remember that for much of the last month, I have been calling for the previous all-time high to be taken out. And the principal reason for that was that if you were to go back and look at this liquidity chart a month ago, 3 weeks ago, even as early as 2 weeks ago, you will remember that there was a lot of short liquidity sat up here. People had been getting into early shorts, and the market was, in my view, was always likely to come back and punish them before rolling over. And that's exactly what we've seen. Pretty much all of the topside liquidity on Bitcoin has been taken out. And what we're left with now is a situation where all of the liquidity, bar this small patch up here, sits beneath where we are now. So people are net long, and I think there's loads of examples of where you can see the really tight correlation between price increase and open interest going up. People traditionally have used futures to go long on Bitcoin rather than short, and people are always over optimistic, and I suspect we're going to get all of this leverage wiped out. And what would that do to the price structure? So it may not seem significant, but if we do get a complete wipeout of all this liquidity in the $105,000 region, then all of the really cocky balls who are celebrating the inevitability that Bitcoin is going to $500,000 will have to contend with the fact that we have taken out all of these highs and price has now been accepted back under and is trading at this $105,000 region. So that's obviously a big if. That's a hypothetical at the moment. But anybody who has been watching the liquidation heat maps in recent months knows that when you start to see too many people on one side of the boat, it's often a sign that the boat is about to capsize and go under. And we've seen that to the upside. I think now we're going to see that to the downside, and that will be the start of a much longer, more pronounced trend down into 2026 and 2027. So for me, I know it's an unpopular opinion to hold, and I know lots of people will say you keep shifting this upper trend line, you're moving the goalposts. I've heard all of it, but I still have a lot of faith in this pattern, and I think there are reasons to believe that Bitcoin is topping out here. Now let's take a quick look at Ethereum. there's a few things that I want to point out on this chart. Firstly, the downside that we saw in this move here was really significant, and it reminds me a bit of the downside that we saw in the first leg down of the 22 bear market, where price made a really significant lower low, bounced back hard, in fairness, you know, from 2,100 to 3,500. It was a really steep increase, and lots of people began to get very optimistic. You know, this downtrend was broken. People began to believe again and thought that Ethereum was on the way back. And I can't help but think that this price action looks really similar. We've seen a very significant sell-off. Yes, we've seen a bounce, and that was always inevitable given that how skewed bearish the market was for Ethereum down here, and prices bounced. But the question is this just one big consolidation, you know, some sort of right-angled wedge that will see price blow off to the upside into the $10,000 region? I know that is a view that is quite popular on X, but my own personal take is that this is still nothing more than a macro lower high before price rolls over. Now, there's a couple of things that we need to bear in mind though when thinking through that possibility. The first is that this trend line, I think, is pretty clean. You know, we've got hit, 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 and then we saw a breakdown back here. And what's happened since is that we've backtested the trend line, and this to me looks like a second backtest that could roll over. The only thing I would say about that position is that this is also a really significant SR zone. And you can see that price has reacted strongly off of this zone on many, many occasions, but has now broken it to the upside. So despite the fact that I am macro bearish here, I'm still prepared to entertain the possibility that Ethereum has one more move to the upside in it before Bitcoin rolls over and the whole market turns south. And what that would look like for me is if we began to consolidate above these highs for a period of a week, possibly 2 weeks, and if all of the liquidity, the delta reset so that longs began to close out, and the market had some sort of kind of balance to it, because at the moment the market is heavily skewed long, and that is normally a sign that a reversal is on the way. But were the market to consolidate and shake off some of those longs, maybe we'd see some wicks down beneath this SR level just to really test the conviction that bulls have here. If we were to consolidate here for the next week, 2, possibly even 3 weeks, I would see that as a bullish sign that this level has been reclaimed. And were that the case, I would expect price to come back into these highs and probably take them out, possibly even take out the all-time high that sits over here. So that is the way that I would be thinking about playing Ethereum. I am really, really open-minded about the fact that Ethereum could push to the upside and that we could see ETH BTC go on some sort of run, having been battered and depressed for so long. Equally, I am also very open to the possibility that this turns out to be a deviation. Price gets back under 2,800, and to me that would be a trigger for a short back into this region, and then if this level broke, which I suspect it would, back into this low here. So those are the two scenarios that I see. One would be consolidation here for a week or two. The market becomes more balanced, longs begin to close out, possibly scared through some short-term wicks beneath this SR level at 2,800, and then we push to the upside. Or alternatively, we see price tuck back under 2,800 in the coming days, and that would be a trigger for a short that I would be targeting down to 2,100 and then back to the yearly low at about 1,400. So that's how I am thinking about playing Ethereum. My bias is still definitely bearish. I would not be surprised if this was just nothing more than a second backtest of this uptrend that has been lost earlier in the year. And a small way of confirming that view would be a daily close under this 2,800 level. What other clues are there in the market? So some of these charts are not new. If you've been following me for a while, you'll know that I've been suggesting for some time that USDC dominance looks bullish on the macro scale. And you can see here that there is this really clearly defined SR level that has led to big reactions in the past. Got a deviation here. And I believe that this SR zone is simply being flipped into resistance once more. So we had this macro sort of falling wedge throughout the positive price action that we've seen for Bitcoin over the last year or two. We've then seen this consolidation and a breakout. Alts have been hit hard on this ramp up in USDC dominance since late 2024. And I suppose the question is this level going to break and give us something like the red scenario where price breaks back under and USDC dominance comes back into these lows and this becomes part of a much larger consolidation? Or is price going to hold here and start to push up and potentially break this resistance zone here and head into, I think, a multi-year bull run on stablecoin dominance, which ultimately means that the price of Bitcoin, Ethereum and other cryptocurrencies is likely to be under serious pressure. And if we just zoom in and we take a look at the daily chart, the reason why I'm not quick to be bullish on Bitcoin and Ethereum here is because if you look since the start of the year, we've had all of these lows in this region. So lots and lots of these lows stacking up in this support region, and we've just taken all of them out, every last one, including these lows here, and we're starting to see support and we're bouncing. And if you follow the market, I mean, you'll know that today, you know, we're having a slight down day for Bitcoin, but look at what's happening to altcoins. Ethereum is down 1.5%, and then some of these coins, you know, Litecoin is down over 3%, Matic, Doge, all of these coins are down 3-4%. So what I'm seeing is early signs that Bitcoin is starting to top out and that the liquidity is definitely skewed downwards from here, and that USDC dominance is finding support at this key SR level. Once again, having taken out all of these lows, we are now seeing, I believe, the early signs of a bounce. So again, just more confluence that I think Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general are going to come under pressure in the weeks ahead. And here's another piece of confluence. So this is the dollar index, the Dixie. I have for such a long time had this rising channel drawn out, and my thesis is that in a stagflationary crisis, markets will crash and that the dollar index will revisit the upper boundary of this rising channel. And recently, probably great timing on my part, for the first time in ages, I started to entertain the possibility that maybe I was wrong and the dollar was going much lower. And lo and behold, almost to the day, earlier in the week, I started to entertain that possibility and start posting about it. And the dollar began bouncing off of the lower boundary of this rising wedge. And so I think, unless this breaks down, there is reason to believe that the strength in the dollar could be sustained. And certainly a reclaim of this key support and resistance zone at about 100 would be, for me, a really strong sign that the dollar is going to push much higher. And potentially, if we see a repeat of what happened in 2022, I think that will be an indication that equity markets and cryptocurrency markets are going to be under a lot of strain. So I'm looking for a reclaim of 100 as the second sign of strength, but we've already got the first sign of strength in that price has begun to bounce from the lower boundary of this rising wedge. So potentially dollar up, just as everybody becomes super bullish on Bitcoin and believes that it's going into the 500k region. There is another clue that I keep pointing to, and if you watch my last couple of videos, you will know that this is a big one for me, and this is the yield curve. And I've pointed out, and you can go back, I've covered this in detail in multiple videos, but periods of yield curve inversion have historically preceded major corrections in the equity market. So this lower pane down here is the S&P 500, and as you can see, in the late 80s, stroke 1990, we got this period of yield curve inversion, and then eventually we saw something like a 20% correction in the stock market, and then we saw something similar around the dot-com boom, where in late 99 into 2000 we saw this yield curve inversion, and eventually, as this yield curve began to disinvert, that marked the top of the S&P, and we saw a really significant 50% correction in the S&P. And it was the same story in 2007, 2008. And my, what do we have here? I mean, just look at this, right? These look like babies in comparison to the kind of yield curve inversion that we've been experiencing in the last 2 years. We saw not only the deepest yield curve inversion in history, but also the longest yield curve inversion in history. And while I keep saying that this is a great indicator of trouble on the horizon, it's not a particularly useful tool for pinpointing a top. And you can see that if you were looking to sell out or go short on yield curve inversion back in, for example, 2006, 2007, you would have had to watch the market grind higher for quite some time before you finally got the kind of correction that we're looking for. And again, I believe that we are seeing something similar here, that the yield curve is beginning to disinvert and has been for some months, but it's taking time for that to translate into lower prices on the stock market. So is it possible that we see some sort of blow off top in markets? Absolutely. But the people that point to the dot-com boom and say, well, this is just another year 2000 scenario where the Nasdaq went vertical and went up 2x in the space of a year, I think they are discounting the fact that if you look back at what happened in the year 2000, as the yield curve began to disinvert, the price of the Nasdaq started to roll over, and we are already seeing that disinversion happening. I think come back in 2 or 3 months and you will have seen significant weakness in the stock market, and crypto, I keep saying this, will not be immune if that happens. You know, there's this idea that Bitcoin goes up no matter what, that it's a risk on asset and it's a risk off asset. I just see no solid rationale or evidence for that being the case. Bitcoin is a risk on asset, highly correlated to the stock market. And if equities get battered, you can expect the price of Bitcoin, and in particular altcoins, to suffer dramatically. So I am bearish on equity still. I still believe that there are macro forces out in the economy, risk that is being flagged by this yield curve inversion that has been happening over the last couple of years. There are serious problems in credit markets. I think bond yields pressing higher, despite the desire of central banks to bring them lower, is another indication that there is trouble on the horizon and that equities are heading much lower. And that will hit Bitcoin hard, and I suspect eventually it will hit Ethereum even harder. And at some point, I do expect to see some of these targets here that I've laid out for Ethereum. And my ultimate target is as low as $89. Now, people will call me crazy, I know, and I wouldn't even rule out completely a move back to these highs in the $4,000, $5,000 region before that happens. But I do genuinely believe that we are seeing the early signs of a dying altcoin market, and they are simply being propped up by the strength in Bitcoin in recent weeks. But when Bitcoin eventually rolls over, some of these are going to go to hell, in my view. And if you look at Ethereum, Bitcoin, you got to remember, guys, I know lots of people are hating on me at the moment saying you were wrong, Bitcoin's at new highs. But I was the guy that back in December told you that ETH BTC was coming into this level. And what's happened? Yes, it's happened more rapidly than I thought it would. But, ETH BTC only found support bang on the level where I said it would when I drew this pattern back at the end of 2024, about 7 or 8 months ago. And so at the moment, in my mind, this looks like nothing more than a back testing of this key level, this pink level, which has previously led to strong reactions in price. And I think we are about to get the same. I suppose, the question for me is it likely that price is going to have some sort of macro rebound, break this trend and head back to the highs in the short term? Well, look, I just don't think that the equity market has got another 6, 12, 18 months of upside in it. I think it is on borrowed time, and I just cannot see, other than potentially a short-term move for ETH BTC, which potentially takes us back here, and then we revisit these lows. That is about as much as I'm prepared to entertain. So again, I'm open-minded about ETH going back to $4,000, potentially even $5,000, but ultimately I still feel that we need a longer period of consolidation where ETH BTC takes probably a couple of years to reset before eventually breaking this downtrend and roaring past Bitcoin in the crypto market. And what gives me confidence in that view? Well, just look at the strength of some of the other leaders in this space, right? This is Solana versus Bitcoin. So it's one thing being bullish on Bitcoin, and I can see why people would be sucked into that position. But those who are continually calling for alt season, in my opinion, are just massively naive and overly optimistic, because what we've seen on the market leader in this cycle, which is Solana, undoubtedly, is this huge period of distribution which lasted about a year, just over a year, and price has finally begun to break down versus Bitcoin. And you can see my projection in blue here. I think we're going much, much lower, and certainly unless we see some sort of reclaim of this level here, which is pretty well defined in my view, I just can see no reason whatsoever to be bullish on the altcoin market. So it's one thing to be a Bitcoin bull. I think it's an entirely different thing to be an altcoin bull. And I'm not saying that some of these small cap altcoins can't catch big bounces. You can't get the kind of scam pumps that you see on some of these exchanges. You can't get those low liquidity meme coins that just fly in the space of a week. But when we talk about some of the larger cap coins, the more established projects in the space like Solana, I am just seeing no reason to believe that this is going to be a strong option versus Bitcoin in the coming months. If anything, this looks like a breakout from a descending broadening wedge and the first macro lower high before price continues back into this region here, which was never tested even at the bottom of the 2022-23 correction. And then it's a similar picture for me on something like AVAX BTC. I think, longer term, I absolutely love the AVAX BTC chart. And I think give it a couple of years to come back and retest the lower boundary of this descending broadening wedge. And when Bitcoin eventually bottoms out, I expect this to go on a huge run. And this chart is probably a bit optimistic on the timing front. I expect the bottom to be more like early 2027. But regardless, where are we at the moment? This to me, this looks like one big range, right? And when price was held at the top of this range for such a long time, you had this support, but then it gave way earlier this year, back in January. I just cannot see a scenario in which this doesn't come back and take out these lows here before we see some sort of reversal in the macro. And that can take a long time. I think people are just really quick to be optimistic on alts, but this could just continue bleeding out against Bitcoin for a long, long time. And until we at least revisit the lower boundary of this descending broadening wedge, and ideally we take out these lows or revisit these lows back here, I just see no reason to be bullish here. We're just stuck in no man's land. We're at probably the midpoint of this big range from here down to here. And in my mind, there's no reason to be overly bullish or optimistic on altcoins at the moment. And there are dozens of other examples I can give you where altcoins have broken structure. They're putting in, lower highs and lower lows. Big uptrends have been broken. I just think fundamentally the altcoin market is about to get destroyed. And if you're sitting around waiting for alt season, you're probably going to be waiting quite a long time. And I'll leave you just with this chart, which is others, so small cap cryptocurrencies versus Bitcoin. And again, what is bullish about this structure, guys? You got this key support and resistance zone here, which gave way back in March. And we are just floating in what I think is a range between these two key levels here. And until we come back into these lows and test the lower boundary of what looks to me like some sort of descending channel, again, I just can't see any reason, were price to bounce over the coming weeks and reclaim this level and break this downtrend, which has capped price since the 2022, late 21, early 22 highs for altcoins. Unless we see a break in this downtrend and a reclaim of this level, then I can see no reason to think that alts, particularly low cap altcoins, are going to outperform Bitcoin. So that's my view on the market. I suppose I could summarize by saying nothing has really changed. I know that we've had a few strong days on Bitcoin, but I still think if you zoom out on the monthly, if you look at that RSI, if you look at the confluence that we've got here at this massive, massive resistance zone, if you look at where liquidity is pointing to at the moment, it's all hinting that we're going to trade lower in the not too distant future. And then when you zoom out and you look at USDC dominance, you look at strength in the dollar, you look at this yield curve disinversion, the potential top in equity markets, I still just think there are loads of reasons to believe Bitcoin is going to get hit much harder than anyone can care to believe. But that is just my view. Lots of people will call me crazy. If we get a breakdown in USDC dominance, then I will entertain the possibility that Bitcoin is going to go much higher. And I will certainly be thinking about spotting some good longs on altcoins, particularly on Ethereum. But until then, not much has changed. So I hope some of that has been useful. I know it's going to annoy a lot of people. But if you have found any of this useful, then please do hit the subscribe button. And remember to follow me on X at Part Time Charts. It's been great to be with you again. Take care, guys.